Good morning. Greetings to each of you. Thank you, Kendall, for the songs. I was really blessed by the songs this morning, and I feel like it's just what I needed. The theme of God's love, I needed to hear that. God's love for me, God loves you. And also, there's a couple songs that had the thought of the way that Jesus invites us to come to him. Isn't that amazing? He's saying, come. He's reaching out to us saying, come. And it's really encouraging to me. What a blessing. I also felt really grateful this morning sitting in church and just thinking about our church and each of you and how grateful I am to be here and to be a part of this church. And thank you for what you mean to us and what you do for us, what you do for me. Thank you so much. The passage today is from James chapter 3. Austin and I have been working through the book of James, and the passage today is James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. And the topic is about the words that we say. It talks about the tongue. It talks about the words that we say. And I want you to think, can you think of a time, think of words that were spoken to you sometime in the past that were hurtful? Is it hard to think about, or is it easy to think about words that were hurtful? I don't know about you, but I remember a lot of words that were hurtful. What about words that built you up, words that were encouraging, words that were kind? I can also think of a lot of those. Words really do affect us. Words really are important. But they're also so common. We speak thousands of words a day. Is it really a big deal? I do believe that it is. Turn with me to James chapter 3, and let's read the passage, and then we'll go from there. James chapter 3. Let's all stand as we read this. James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea, is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. You may be seated. So are words really a big deal? There's a saying in our American culture, it comes from an Old English rhyme that says, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Is that true? I'd say no. It's absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. It'd be more accurate to say that sticks and stones may break my bones, and the pain will last a little while, but words are far more powerful, and the pain will last much longer. When I refer to the tongue, talking about the tongue is small but mighty, words are cheap but costly, kind of the title of the sermon. When I talk about the tongue, I'm talking about the words that we say. When I'm talking about words or the tongue, I'm also including words that are written. We communicate a lot through text messages, and so any of the truths that apply to speaking would also apply to text messages or to writing. All right, let's look at the first section. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that you shall receive a stricter judgment. My understanding is that in the Greek, this word teacher is referring to someone in the official role of a teacher, somebody who's officially a teacher. And One commentator said that possibly to the original audience, there was, the teacher was held in very high regard. At a high position, he had a lot of authority, a lot of influence. And so maybe a young Christian would say, you know what, I want to be a teacher. I want to have that influence, that prestige. I want to have that power. And Paul and the writer here is saying, wait a minute, be careful. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with being a teacher. So for this section, I want to think of the word responsibility. Now, I also think that this idea of responsibility that comes with our communication would also apply in other areas. I think this applies to a parent. A lot of influence over their children. This applies to how we influence people, our friends, influencing people online through social media. Anytime that we're speaking, we're communicating, we're influencing, it comes with responsibility. Verse 2 then says, for we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in the word, he's a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. So this verse is talking about discipline. Right? Discipline is hard. There's lots of ways that we should discipline our lives. If we live an undisciplined life, we're going to be a detriment or a hindrance to ourselves and to others, our community. Discipline is hard, right? Habits of good exercise and good sleep, spiritual disciplines, all those different disciplines are hard. But the hardest is in disciplining our words, our tongue. This also points out that, you know what? We are going to stumble. In this area of our speech, we are going to stumble. And so this should also help us think of the responsibility we have whenever we're in a position of influence, because we are going to make a mistake, and we should not take that lightly. So let's not be too eager to be in a position of influence. Or maybe it'd be better to say, let's be careful with the responsibility that comes with being in influence, whether it's online or here in church or in your family. Recognize the responsibility that comes with it. The tongue is small but mighty. Words are cheap but costly. All right, the next section here. Next section has a couple of different examples of how the tongue is small but mighty. Verse 3 there talks about a horse and a bit in the horse's mouth. So a bit is the part of the harness of a horse that goes in the mouth, that's connected to the bridle that goes over the horse's head, and that's connected to the reins that the rider or the driver can hold. So think about the difference between the horse and the bit. Most horses are pretty large. Some are huge. And they're pretty strong, much stronger than people. A horse can carry a rider for a long distance over as it's riding. It can pull a lot of weight in a wagon or a cart or a sled or a sleigh. A horse can charge into battle. A horse can plow the ground, can cultivate the soil. So much potential, so much power. But what about the bit in the horse's mouth? There's not really a whole lot that thing can do. It's not really attractive. It doesn't weigh very much. There's not much you can do with it. But if it's in the horse's mouth, and if it's in the hands of a good driver or rider, the potential is incredible. The power of the bit is the influence. And so for this section, I want to think about the word influence. Verse 4 is making the same point with a different example, talking about the ships. Ships are huge. And in the back of the ship is this little thing called a rudder. The rudder doesn't really do much in one sense. It goes back and forth. It can't help the boat float. It can't power the boat forward. It can't give the passengers a nice ride. It can't unload cargo when it gets to port. In some ways, its function is pretty minor. It just goes back and forth. But the influence that it has over the ship is really significant, right? It directs where the entire load of cargo and passengers are going to go. The power of influence. And so in a similar way, the tongue is small, and yet the influence that it carries is tremendous. In some ways, the functions of the tongue are pretty limited. It's not the most attractive part of our bodies. We often don't see it, and yet the influence of what we say is tremendous. Verse 5 also talks about how great a forest a little fire kindles. This month out in California, there's been large fires. Think about the amount of forest that is burned. Think about the houses that have been destroyed. Think about the cost of those buildings, of the towns, the cost of fighting the fires. All that started from what? A little flame. A little flame. And so, our tongue is small but mighty. It's small, but it carries great influence. Huge issues, huge problems, pain, insecurities. So much can come from a careless word or an angry word. Verse 5 says, see how great a forest a little fire kindles. Verse 6 says, the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So much is at stake when we open our mouths to speak. Influence. The next section, verses 7 and 8, says, for every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. When Mark and I were in Thailand, we were there for 8 months studying at a school. And one night we went to a night safari and we got to watch a tiger show. So there was these people who were voluntarily in a cage with large tigers. And they had trained the tigers to do tricks. It was pretty cool to watch. I don't think I would want to be in there with the tigers. But even though people can train and tame tigers, this says that we can't tame the tongue. No man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. It's pretty strong. Unruly evil, full of deadly poison. This is a pretty serious warning. And next I want to look at some verses, some words that Jesus spoke about words. So Jesus in Matthew 12 is talking to the Pharisees. He calls them a brood of vipers. It's pretty strong. And then he says, this is Jesus speaking, how can you, excuse me, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. A good man, out of the good treasure of his heart, brings forth good things. And an evil man, out of the evil treasure, brings forth evil things. So the reason it's impossible for us to tame our tongues is because what's in our hearts is going to come out at some point. We can try so hard, and yet what's in our heart is going to come out. And what's in our heart? Our hearts are evil. Our hearts are evil. But this is where the gospel comes in. Because while, yes, all of us have broken God's law, and that has separated us from him, if we're willing to acknowledge that, to confess our sin, to believe in Jesus, who allowed himself to be nailed to the cross and wounded, allowed himself to bleed, to pay for our sin, God forgives us. He makes us his children. He gives us a new heart. That in Jesus, we are a new creation, and that includes a new heart. And that is our hope for changing our speech. Because on our own, we can't tame our tongue. Only God can do that. Only God can do that. I don't think this means that we're going to reach sinless perfection. I believe that's what the Bible teaches, that we won't reach sinless perfection. But God is working to cleanse us. And we call that sanctification. An ongoing process of our hearts being changed, our hearts being cleansed and made more like him. And that is going to come out in our speech. And so if we do have negative speech patterns, if we do speak unkindly, while we can't hope to tame our tongues ourselves, our hope is that God can do that. God can change our hearts and change our speech. So for this section, I'm going to write the word untamable. Untamable. All right, the last section, verses 9 through 12. Says, with it, referring to our tongue, our speech, with our tongues, with our mouths, with our words, we bless God and Father, and with it we curse men, who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fish. I don't know about you, but I don't usually go to the faucet in my house and get a cup of water and smell it and see if it's salty today. I expect it to be fresh. And when I go to the ocean, I don't think, I wonder if the ocean is going to be fresh water today. We know it's going to be salty. And so I think of the word integrity. Integrity is the idea of always being consistent. Just like salt water always being salt water, a freshwater spring always bringing forth fresh water. Integrity. We know, sadly though, when it comes to our words, we do both speak words of blessing and words of cursing. Words that build people up and words that tear people down. And verse 10 says, my brethren, these things ought not to be so. It's not how it should be, right? We should speak with integrity. We should speak words that build up. God himself is completely consistent. He is our example of what integrity is going to be like. And while we're not going to be just like him in that, it is something that we should strive to grow in, to consistently speak words of love. And I'd like to speak specifically to us fathers. As I've thought about this topic of integrity and of how we speak, I thought about us fathers and the influence that we have over our children. The influence we have. I think it's more than we realize. I think the good that we can potentially do is more than we realize, and the harm that we can do is more than we realize. And so, to all of us, but especially to us fathers, let's be men of integrity. Let's speak words of life, words of truth in our home. Our children, they're going to be able to see when we're lacking integrity. They're going to be able to see when we act one way in public. We put on a happy face. We try to act like we have everything together. But at home, we speak unkindly. Or we speak harshly. They're going to see that. And it's going to impact them. So what do we do? Well, for one thing, we can go to our children and apologize. Children are very gracious and quick to forgive. We can also go to God and confess our sin and ask him to forgive us. And ask him and beg him to change our hearts. To be consistent, to speak words of life. So at the beginning, I asked the question, are words really a big deal? Does this stuff really matter? I'm convinced that from this passage, this is a really big deal to God. And actually, the Bible has a lot to say about our words. I think in the book of Proverbs alone, there's like 60 verses that talk about speaking and the tongue. So I'm convinced this is important to God, but I want to look at another verse that speaks about this, the importance. Matthew 12:36 says, but I say to you that every idle or careless word that men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. We speak so many words so freely, so thoughtlessly, and yet God wants us to know that one day we will give account for what we say. God is aware of what we're saying, and it matters to him. So, something else I always want to think about is, this passage is a really serious warning. I think we should take it seriously, and we should ask God to convict us if we're speaking in ways that are unkind or unhelpful. But in thinking about words, think about how God speaks. I mean, for one thing, just think about the fact that God speaks. God has spoken to humanity in ways that we can understand. And he still speaks through his word and through his spirit today. God is using words, the power of words. God always speaks with integrity. He's always love. He always speaks the truth. And I think that even sharing a challenging, a hard, convicting passage like this is an example of God's love. God didn't just leave us guessing about the power of words. He made it very clear. And that is love. What if we would be clueless about how important this is? What if we would just go about life not realizing this is a big deal? Not realizing that the power we have and the responsibility we have. But no, God spoke to us and told us how important it is. So next I want to think about some specific sins of the tongue. Some specific sins of the tongue. I wasn't sure if is it really necessary to go through and talk about some of the specific ways that we sin with our tongues? But I decided to go ahead and do it because it is really important to God. And so I'd like us to think about this. And I invite you to ask God to convict you.
What does convict mean?
Convict?
Yes.
It means that God shows you where you're sinning. And it's actually a way that God shows us his love.
So basically, God is going to tell you where you're sinning.
That's what we're asking for, yes. All right, so one place is in profanity. So what is profanity? Profanity is trivializing the sacred. So God commands that we don't take his name in vain. So when we use God's name or a form of his name as a curse word, we're trivializing the sacred. We're taking something that's very sacred and we're making it dirty or ugly, and that is profanity. Another example is lying, and this is in the category of talking with others. So I tried to make different categories just to kind of organize it a little bit. Talking with others. So we have lying. So this is probably a really common one that we think of, ways that we might sin with our words. Saying something that is false, making a false statement. But this could also include exaggeration. It could also include not telling the whole truth. And so when we're talking, we can ask ourselves, is what I'm saying true? Because we want to avoid lying. The next category is talking about others. And some of these definitions and thoughts come from a book called Respectable Sins by Jerry Bridges. He has a chapter about the sins of the tongue. And the book is all about things that the Bible teaches are sin, but are kind of acceptable in society. Isn't that interesting? Like some of the sins of the Bible are really unacceptable in our society. We know it's bad. It's looked on unfavorably. But it gets a little tricky when there's some things that are, it's kind of accepted. It's like, well, everybody does it. It's not, might feel like it's not as big of a deal. But the Bible is the standard of what is true. So that's what we want to look at. And so some of these thoughts are thoughts from Jerry Bridges in his book. So talking about others, we have gossip. What is gossip? Gossip is the spreading of unfavorable information about someone else, even if that information is true. However, gossip is often based on rumor, which makes the sin even worse. So think about that. Spreading information that makes somebody look bad, it's bad enough if it's true, right? And we shouldn't do it even if it's true. But what if it's a rumor? What if it might not even be true? Think about how harmful that is. The next one is slander. So this is really similar to gossip. This has the idea of making a false statement or misrepresentation about another person that defames or damages a person's reputation. So political campaigns are notorious for this, right? We just witnessed this not long ago. Both sides trying to defame the other one, trying to demonize the other one, trying to damage their reputation for their own gain. That's slander. Do we as Christians ever do that? Well, hopefully we don't do it like that, but there's more subtle ways to do that. For instance, if we're ascribing motives to somebody, so we see them doing something and we say, oh, I know why they did that. Or I know what they meant by that. It was this. If that's defaming them, it might be a false statement. We might not actually know their motive. What if what they intended was good and it came out wrong? We're misrepresenting or making an assumption about their motive. That is slander. We might also do this when we're misrepresenting them. Maybe they said something and we're twisting it just a little bit to make them look bad. That's an example of slander. And then we also have critical speech. So this is negative comments about someone. They actually be true, but that don't need to be said. Critical speech. And so we should ask ourselves, is what I'm going to say is what I'm going to say kind? Does it really need to be said? We think about avoiding critical speech. What about talking to others? The last category here. So talking about others, but talking to others. So the common theme in this list is forms of negative speech that tend to put down or humiliate other people, or make other people, or hurt them. So for instance, harsh words. Harsh words can put people down, can humiliate them. And, coming back to us fathers, as fathers, we experience a lot of pressures in life. We have the pressures of work. We have the financial pressure to provide for our family. Sometimes we become impatient. And sadly, when we feel that way, because we do have a lot of responsibility, we do have a lot of things to try to manage. And yet that impatience and that frustration can come out in harsh words. And sadly, we can hurt the ones we love the most. Isn't that sad? The ones we love the most may be the ones who hear those harsh words. What about sarcasm? So I don't know how you all feel about sarcasm. I've been thinking about this, and I'd like to just share my thoughts, and you can agree or disagree. If you disagree, I'd be curious to hear afterwards some of your thoughts on this. But so sarcasm, this is tricky. The thing with sarcasm is that there's two layers, right? The one layer is that it's funny. And humor is good. It's good to have fun together, to make people laugh. It's good. But it's sarcasm because underneath is something else. Underneath is a comment that's actually intended to maybe express contempt or to ridicule or some form of rebellion. And it's tricky because there are the two layers, right? And so you would, it's tricky because it's funny. And what can happen is the entire room might laugh except for one person, the person who's the brunt of that sarcasm. And so that is why I'm suggesting, is this maybe actually not healthy? Because, if everybody laughs except for one person, it's still not healthy. So sarcasm is really funny unless it's directed to you. Then it's not funny. I think sarcasm can also be passive aggressive. Maybe you want to push back against an authority figure. You would never actually express contempt or rebellion. But sarcasm can be a way to do that in a way that doesn't quite feel as direct. Kind of an indirect way to push back. And so I'm just suggesting to think about this. And is this actually a healthy form of speech? Or is this an unhealthy form of speech? Does it build people up or does it tear people down? So I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts afterwards, what you all think about this.
My thoughts
But
are.
think about it.
So
Okay.
the Bible says literally
So,
the correctness, right?
The next one is insults. So this is much more direct. So sometimes we insult people. Maybe if we're angry, maybe if we want to put them down, we might use insults. Or ridicule. Maybe we would want to ridicule somebody to try to gain advantage over them or express our frustration. And these are pretty obviously negative speech patterns that are harmful. And we probably wouldn't set out to do this. We wouldn't say that it's good, but sometimes it slips out. And so I think we want to be aware of that. So these are a lot of different types of sins of the tongue, negative speech patterns. Well, is there a simple way to try to remember how should we be speaking? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29 has a really good guide. And this is in the ESV. It says, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So that's a simple way to remember what is good speech and what is bad speech. Maybe simple in the fact that it's, is it building people up or is it corrupting? But actually really hard to do because there's so many ways that we might want to speak that is actually corrupting. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. And this verse comes after a few verses early in the chapter. Paul's talking about our responsibility as believers. He's talking to believers, and there's a responsibility to put on what is good and put off what is bad in our lives. And so we as believers have a responsibility to grow in this. Paul says earlier that you put off concerning your former conduct the old man, which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. So we as believers have a responsibility to put off the sins of the flesh, to put on that which is good. So let's look next at words that build up. What about gratitude? Gratitude, expressing gratitude to God for who he is and what he's done, and expressing gratitude to each other for who people are, for what they do for you. Gratitude. Or what about encouragement? Seeing the good in people and telling them that. Seeing the good that you see in them. Cheering people on in their accomplishments and their wins. Believing in people when they fail and telling them that. What about blessing? Verses from the Bible that we can speak over somebody, calling out the good we see in them, praying for God's supernatural blessing. Here again, fathers, I think we have an opportunity here. Remember a couple of times, my dad blessing my brothers and I. It was kind of formal, like he put his hands on our head and prayed a prayer of blessing. So as fathers, we can do that. That's a way that we can use our words to build our children up. How about this? Building other people up behind their back. I can't think of a word that means that. So we have negative, on the negative side, we have something like gossip, right? Tearing people down behind their back. But I can't think of a word in our language that just simply means building people up behind their back. So I was kind of curious as I thought about that. I wonder why there isn't a word. Maybe there's one I just haven't thought about. For some reason, we tend to tear people down behind their backs. We're not as quick to build people up behind their backs. Now, our words of encouragement and blessing those are often spoken directly to the person. We should do that. But it seems good to also build people up behind their back. I wonder what kind of a difference this would make if all of us here would grow. If all of us would speak negative words less and speak positive, encouraging, life-giving words more. What kind of difference would this make in your personal life, in your family, in our church, in our community, at work? I wonder what difference it would make. I think it would be more than we expect. I think it would make a bigger difference than we think. All right, so I'd like to do this as a prayer all together. And I'd like to read this. So I'm just going to go through it first, and then we can read it all together. So starting out saying, Dear God. The first one is there, please change my heart. Right? Because we know that the sins of the tongue actually start in our heart. The next one is, please help me to speak in ways that build others up. This is what we want to do. This is what God wants us to do. And the last one, please help me to not speak in ways that tear others down. All right, so let's read this prayer together. Dear God, please change my heart. Please help me to speak in ways that build others up. Please help me to not speak in ways that tear others down. So, I invite you to pray this week. Ask God to do this. Ask God to convict you if you're speaking in ways that are tearing people down. I'd like to close with this prayer of blessing from Numbers chapter 6. I'm going to just read these verses as a prayer, a blessing to you all. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless you.